Revelation 1440. From the 28th of May 1940. Apostasy from God. Fight of light against darkness. Everything that went out from God stands in higher development until it is united with God again, because what went out from Him is spiritual power. It is some kind of entity, which was originally determined to work in the same will with God. But their will of this spiritual was unbound. It was, because of its divine origin, without any compulsion. And this unbound will was the cause that the spiritual separated itself from God, in the recognition of its own power, which God had likewise granted to that which had come forth from Him. God did not hinder the will of that which came out of Him, but set limits to its activity. Countless entities emerged from the mighty will of their power which now consciously opposed God. And also these entities were again the outflow of divine power, because also that counter power was a receiver of divine power. Only that those entities were now animated by the drive to fight against God and divine love, instead of them longing for union with Him. And so, in order to lead the power flowing out of Him back to Himself, God had to make an agreement with His opponent. He had to, further, leave to Him free will and gave Him the assurance of giving His power, but at the same time take away, the power to force the will of the entities that were called into being by this power. Italicized words were added to the handwritten text Z. It should be left to these entities themselves to turn to God or to His opponent. And now a struggle for them began, but from both sides, it was fought with different means. Now the light fought against the darkness. Because everything what turned against God was dark, while from God, light and love went out uninterruptedly. The entity, which was born through the will of darkness, was led into the circuit of divine love. The superiority of the beings devoted to God spread such bright light, that this became visible to the entities which had emerged from darkness, and now the beings fought against each other. The light beings tried to draw the dark beings to themselves, while the latter harassed the beings of light and tried to pull them down. This perpetual fight was however insofar unsuccessful as the light beings now could not work in the depth according to the fullness of their light. They were not allowed to hinder the beings in their free will. But these, the antipole of God, had in His power. And He succeeded in rebelling, with all His produce against everything filled with light. Therefore the darkness rebelled against God Himself, because the beings of light were His representatives, they were His creatures which came out of Him and were devoted to Him. This rebellion against God was the most serious sin and had to find its expiation according to divine justice. The spiritual of darkness had to atone for its rebellion against God, who was the highest being in highest perfection. And at the same time, the opponent himself had to be forced down. And so God let the creation come into being, and all spiritual that opposed Him was banished in this creation. His free will was taken away from Him. Now the entities, which had refused obedience to God, had to enter into a serving relationship. The entity could not make itself free through its will, but it was subject to the divine will, until, for the examination of its will, it was granted a gracious time of embodiment on earth, and now free will was given to it again, and the entity was now once more confronted with the choice to find its way back to God or to strive for separation from God again. And it failed the will of the unredeemed being. The power, the influence of the adversary was still so strong, that it pressed the will of the beings and their embodiment as a human being to belong to it. And the distress of these beings was immense. Then the eternal divinity had mercy on your creatures anew. He descended Himself to the bound beings. God banished the power of the adversary by opposing his hatred and unkindness with His infinite love, and thus redeemed mankind from its tormentor. His love was greater and stronger than hatred, which subjugated man's free will to the point of fullest surrender. He overcame death, that is the powerless state of the will bound by the adversary. And thus double redemption was brought to the spiritual. Once the power of the adversary was limited, so that the being, which carried a desire for God, remained completely unimpressed by that power. But then the adversary was deprived of all power over the works of creation, so that his whole power consists only in having a weakening effect on the will of man, but this effect can be completely cancelled, if the will of man consciously turns to God. Amen.